Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Kiefner with Inspired You Coaching. And today I have fellow coach Alina Vehuni, who's joining me today. We are going to talk about our experiences with education. We both have a very big passion for disrupting it as the way it is today. And my journey is I want to help kids who struggle with what they want to be when they grow up, or even adults. And that's part of my mission as a coach. And today, Alina and I are going to discuss why we're so passionate about it and what we're going to do about it. So, Alina, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'll tell you a little bit about my story. Is I always struggled as a kid with what is it that I want to be? My dad was a pharmacist. I knew I didn't like science or math to be a pharmacist. And that was what I was really exposed to, was his profession for years. And so I liked radio and television. I thought I wanted to be an anchor woman. And then I got into school for that. Didn't really enjoy it. Went through various degrees or majors in college, and then different careers as I grew older. And I am passionate about educating kids on what all is out there in this world for careers, and also maybe college isn't for you. And so what else is out there for someone who doesn't really enjoy school in that way? That's kind of how I came into it. And I know you being an educator and principal, it's a little different. So tell me your story.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you for sharing your story. We all have one. Mine is a little different. It's interesting, but I think growing up, I had known, it felt like I've always known who I wanted to become. And there was this strong desire and passion for languages and really impacting the world at a larger scale. I've always wanted to be an interpreter for the United Nations and work, with I don't know, presidents and just the different people who really had the power of decision making. And what I've always believed is that communication is really the key. So I really wanted to be that person who facilitated the communication and really helped develop that understanding across the nations and across the cultures. And I felt that language was absolutely integral to that. And so it's always been my passion. And so growing up as a teenager, I remember when my friends and classmates were reading books on romance and you name it, I was just learning a language after another, and I was spending hours reading dictionaries. I mean, how boring it is, right? But when you're driven by passion and you know exactly what you want to do, it's the most exciting thing. But I grew up, and by my family's very, very strong advice, I actually ended up becoming an engineer. And I find that for a lot of us, the economics of the time really dictate who we become. And our parents, with the best intentions, because they truly love us, they want us to have the safety and the security and a stable income. And so that has been my trajectory. I ended up in an engineering school. So my undergrad is in microelectronic engineering. I worked barely a year as an engineer because it had nothing to do with my passions. I remember that day when I actually brought my diploma after 5 years being in school, and I gave it to my grandfather and I said, here is what you've requested. Now I'm going to go and learn languages. And that's exactly what I did. I actually started at a language school. And while I was taking courses in English, I was invited to teach some other languages because I had really deep level of proficiency in some other languages that I was interested growing up as a teenager. And so I got hired to work there, but really everything changed for me when we moved to the United States. And at the time, I already had my first son, who was 2 years old. And then shortly after, I had my second son. And so just really trying to understand and learn the education system just kind of from within and see how I could be the best advocate for their education, because I felt like I did not get to advocate for myself growing up because I ended up with a degree that to me was not meaningful. I didn't see myself pursuing a career with that. I actually started volunteering in my son's classroom, and I absolutely fell in love with just being in that environment and with children, and just seeing how young hearts and minds are being shaped by the adults around them and by the environment that they create. And long story short, I pursued a career in education and went from a classroom volunteer to a school principal in the matter of probably 10 years. And in that entire process, I've realized that there is so much more that education can offer to children, beyond, standardized, just kind of approach to teaching the disciplines, and then the high stakes assessments that have the best intentions, but they often almost encourage many kids kind of fall through the cracks because they are in constant kind of pursuit of meeting the demands and the requirements and the expectations, and not really having an opportunity to learn who they are, what they like, what their strong suits are, what their gifts and passions are. They're almost channeled into just kind of the same way as just choosing the career that makes money, at that given time, and then just getting the degree and getting the job, and just it's almost the same path. But there's so much more I've realized that we can do as educators and parents, and that's why I'm super passionate to offer alternative kind of avenues and other opportunities for children to find their true selves and make their biggest contribution to the world.
That's so beautifully said. And I agree with you. And that's why we're talking today is we both are on this mission to kind of change how kids learn. One of the things I think why I struggled in school was because there were subjects that I did not like, didn't really resonate with me, math, science. And so I didn't do well because I needed to learn. That's the other thing is I needed to learn in a different way than the way teachers taught, right? Things at you. Sometimes I have to percolate on it. I have to really look at it to understand it. And so my learning way didn't resonate with some of the way the teachers taught. And I think that's probably profound everywhere. As Jim
That
Quick
is
even says, right?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I mean, we all have our own way of learning, and that's why it's so important to find that individualized approach. But it goes beyond that. I feel like there's a strong emphasis in the current system to help people overcome their weaknesses, which is really important. But that's really, it seems like it's more prevalent rather than identifying the strengths and really capitalizing on them. I've been fascinated by highly successful people, those who make a large scale global impact. And I've researched a number of them and really trying to understand what makes them who they are. And what I've found, I think it's one of the things that's really, it just kind of permeates, like you can see it across the board, is for them to really building upon their passions and strengths, right? And learning skills and the capacity, developing capacities that they need in order to continue their exponential growth. But it's really what drives them from within, what motivates them intrinsically to do what they're doing. And that is something that is not given enough attention, I find, in the current system. And so we do have inherent talents and gifts. We're actually born with them, right? So I think there's a better way for us to approach of how people can develop those. And first of all, identify them and then develop them and just really align their career or whatever they choose to do in life with their gifts and passions. And that really brings that fulfillment that just working for money never really does.
No, I'm a true result of that I made really good money at a certain job in sales, but it wasn't my passion. And maybe this career, I'm in a passionate career, but I might not make as much money as I did. I'm good with that because every day is joyful for me. And so that's a whole nother topic we could talk about. Well, so if I could give you a magic wand and you could create education based on the way that you would like to see it, how would it look?
Wow, that is such a good question. Um, well, I would definitely see it in a completely different model. I think the foundation of it is really emotional intelligence, and I would even say trauma healing, because what I find working with both children and adults, um, we all carry some amount of trauma, whether we realize it or not, right? Some of it is identified if we had more adverse childhood experiences. For some others, it kind of goes unnoticed, but it does manifest in different ways, as blockages, throughout our life. And so that is something that I think should be universally screened, and the support needs to be provided at the level that the person needs. And emotional intelligence is really, at the foundation of it is self-regulation. And then as we learn those self-regulation practices, we grow to become really good co-regulators. And that's really the communication and how we socialize with the world, right? And so that is something that I think is absolutely essential to build. So those are the two types of intelligences, as I call them, that are fundamental to who we are and who we become. And beyond that is really identifying what individual child or person is really good at, what their talents and gifts are. And through exploration, I strongly, strongly believe in experiential learning, is having opportunities to explore and to see what's out there and what the world offers, and to see how well it connects with the gifts and passions that they have. And then from there, identify what are the capacities and skills that they need to build and need to learn and develop. And so really having this very holistic approach that creates that union, or I should say coherence, of the heart and the mind, and just really utilizing the body, not only of our intellectual just kind of capacities, the wisdom of our intellect, but also the wisdom of our neural network around the heart, so their emotional intelligence, as well as just the body wisdom, as we call it, somatic intelligence. So I think bringing those three things as a foundation in alignment and just building upon that, I truly see a way of creating an opportunity for students to identify their path at a very young age, in order to help humanity solve its biggest challenges. So ideally, I would like to see it being aligned with the sustainability development goals of the United Nations, and is really giving the kids an opportunity to engage in real life problem solving that is aligned with larger challenges, things that are much bigger than them. So they would constantly push themselves and expand to learn more, to collaborate more, in order to make a contribution. So the way I see, even, I mean, it really goes down to the language level. Somebody who has background in neurolinguistic programming, I can even see homework being called a contribution. Because how boring is it to do a homework? Whereas if you need to work on something and you can contribute through that to your community, even if it's just your family, even if helping or improving the life of one other person, that's already a contribution. Or even making your own self, much better, smarter, more loving, more giving, that's a contribution. Because at that point, then you can really start making a difference in the world. So even seeing, I don't know, a lesson being called a quest, or the educational course being called an exploration, I feel like the language itself adds a completely different lens of how we can approach education. And more than anything, that brings authentic engagement. Now, one thing that we saw, I think, in 2020, even as an educator, I've seen it before that, but 2020 really showed us how disengaging learning can be, particularly remotely. I have a number of educator friends who teach their class, and there's not a single camera turned on. There's a group of 30 students on the other end of the camera, and you cannot see anybody's face. And so it's really hard to know what they're doing, how engaged they are, because there's hardly any communication. So there's a lot of lessons that we'll learn in education from 2020. It's a very long conversation. It's multifaceted. I would really love to have that discussion with you at some point. But in a nutshell, I think we really need to align all human motivators in the education model in order for our students to be authentically engaged, learn in a purposeful manner, driven by their gifts and passion, and really learning that anything they do, or they choose to do, or they choose not to do even, it has an effect on people around them and at the larger humanity. And so really teaching them from a very young age that you can make a contribution beyond what you can imagine.
What do you think the world would look like then if this type of education was really instilled? How do we see it benefiting the world?
Well, if we are raising a generation that already are aware of what the challenges are, and they're intentionally developing skills and capacities in order to solve those challenges and collaboratively, right, co-constructing that knowledge and co-creating that future with others, and that is aligned with what they are truly passionate about, and they can bring their best and their strong suits, their gifts and talents into it, so they will be fully motivated, they will be fully engaged, committed to contribute. And I think that's really that would allow people to live a life of fulfillment, so really have that personal fulfillment as an individual and as a professional, and that will really allow the larger humanity to benefit from what they have to offer. And I think, every time I think about this, it seems like it's just a dream that will never come true. But I think with an intentional approach and creating the systems and structures that it takes, it will become a reality. It can become a reality.
It does seem like a very big task to take on. So what do you think could be a small thing that we could start incorporating in a school, maybe a separate kind of school? What could be a small step?
I think the very first step is self-awareness, right? It's just for really either offering a program or even some sort of an assessment, right? For students to really come to understand who they are, what they like, what they dislike, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, right? So it really starts from there. It starts with awareness. So if we can cultivate that awareness as a foundation for everything that I'm just talking about for us to build upon, that's a really small step, I think, to undertake, and then just go from there. There are a number of tools to do that, and I think it can be either synthesized into something more comprehensive, or it can be applied just as it is. But I think really cultivating that self-awareness, self-regulation, and then from there, developing that co-regulation that I mentioned earlier, that's a place to start.
And in all the years that you've been in education, you didn't see that anywhere, or did you?
It does exist in pockets, of course, but I think the approach is more, I think what I would really like to see is a more proactive approach, and it's just in a very systemic way, help children develop that awareness, because oftentimes it happens in a more reactive fashion when there's already an issue. Now we need to work with a student and just kind of pull those resources and just address what's already perceived to be a negative circumstance, right? Whereas if we do it proactively and we really empower every child in that way from the very beginning, as a part of the systemic approach, I think that's a completely different way of educating our children.
You sent me an article that there is a country that is starting that. Am I correct in that? Remember? Memory? Australia?
Yes, I think, well, in Australia, I believe some schools already have the inherent gifts and talents, just kind of assessment. You enter a school with that. So they definitely validate who you are and what you have to offer. And then just kind of they build an individualized education program based on that, which I believe is super powerful. Yes, there, of course, like I said, there are pockets of it, happening in different ways around the world. And I think there is a cultural layer to all of that because every culture sees things differently. And that's why just really collaborating, across nations and across cultures and countries is so important because there's always modified version of things that can be implemented that has proven to work and be effective elsewhere.
At what age do you think a kid could be assessed for their skills and talents when you're not exposed to it as a little kid? I mean, you are, but not to that level. What age would you say that would be a great time to start?
That is a great question, and I think that really takes back to just just human development and child development and just the neuroscience of it. It can be assessed from a very, very young age, except the assessment looks very different, right? So you get, instead of the child taking the assessment or the person taking the assessment, it's people around them, they observe and really take notes. So it can actually be done from a very young age. And having done research on the brain development of babies, even infants, we can now see, I think the new neuroscience and the new behavioral psychology, what they say is that even at that age, we can really see the preferences, we can see the strengths, and we can see what the infants choose, they choose things over the other. And so that really helps us understand what they might stand within their likes and dislikes. And of course, it's a very deep topic for a different conversation, but it can be assessed at a very, very young age, except the assessment tools look different.
Oh, that's interesting. I want to go back to the trauma topic that we were talking about earlier, that trauma looks different for everyone. And when you touched on that, a child who maybe is even in the womb, if there could be trauma going on in the womb that they don't even know about until years later, that maybe their mom was going through so a lot of stress or being abused or drugs, anything that causes trauma to them that doesn't manifest for years. So trauma, let's talk about trauma and just how it's so different in different layers. It doesn't have to be physical or mental abuse. It could even be being bullied in school that causes trauma.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's actually very clear. The research is very clear that bullying does create trauma. And it's interesting you mentioned that in a womb, the child can be already just kind of showing signs of trauma. I was reading an article the other day that it was about a research that showed that what they did, they studied pregnant women, just mothers to be, and what they found that their own childhood experiences, the adverse experiences in their childhood, have already shaped or changed the circuitry of their brain of the unborn fetus. So right now we're talking about generational trauma, and that's something that I think we're learning more and more as collective humanity, and that's a real thing. And I could even trace it back in my own family, because my great grandmother was a genocide survivor. And on the day of the tragedy, her entire family was massacred in front of her eyes. And she was a 15-year-old girl at the time. And she had no family growing up. She had to marry at a very young age, and her husband was in his 40s. So you can imagine the dynamics in that family, right? So the only family she found later in her life were her own children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and I'm the oldest one in that generation of her great-grandchildren. So I could really see that in my own family, with my mother, with my grandfather, that unhealed trauma was really evident, in her generations, and it will come up in different ways. So, and that's why I feel like we may not necessarily experience trauma firsthand. So it might not be part of our own experience. It may not even be part of our parents' experience or even grandparents' experience, but it really goes back generations, but it can definitely manifest in different ways. So going back to universal screening and really understanding that trauma is very different things, and it can show up very differently. It could be, child can be traumatized even from being denied ice cream when they ask, right? So it's really how we emotionally respond to it, and then also how we heal trauma, because it's not necessarily a cognitive process, it's more of an embodied process of healing trauma. And so it's just a fascinating field, and I think we're learning more. There's way more information these days than ever before, and we're really, new fields of psychology and neuroscience are actually opening up to allow for the new findings. And that's very interesting. So I really find that trauma can definitely be an obstacle. It can prevent us from developing the right beliefs, the belief system, right? Developing the right mindset in order for us to fully become who we can become. And it can definitely prevent us from socializing the way we should, or just communicating or networking and really creating that social capital, which is so important for self-actualization. So that's why I feel like really addressing trauma from a very young age, and it's an ongoing process, and more than anything, equipping people with tools and techniques for them to heal their own trauma as they grow up, because it is possible. It's definitely powerful. So that way they can really sustain the well-being at every level, regardless of what life throws at them.
Yeah, we could go on and on about trauma, and quick story about limiting beliefs that you just touched on is I have this limiting belief that I'm not smart because in school I was not an A student. I was a C and B student. Now C's and B's to some people are, well, you got by, and to others like, oh my God, that's terrible. You should be an A student. Well, looking back, it was because of how I was taught, what I was interested in, and what I was not interested in. So the grades I did get an A in were the sociologies, the psychologies, the English language, all those kind of things, versus the math and the science and history or whatever it may be. But so those limiting beliefs of I'm not smart have carried in throughout my adulthood, but not only until self-actualization that you mentioned did I figure that out. So I think that is so important too, to understand to get self-actualized at a younger age than at mine. Right. So I'm very passionate about that, teaching kids that as well.
Yes, likewise, likewise. And just really going back, and even in the same trauma healing, I think what is quite often used as a strategy or as a technique is really connecting with your inner child, right? And remembering what you like to do when you were a child, right? What were your passions when you were a child? What you were interested in when you were a child is really connecting us back to just kind of the core, right? The foundation of who we are as an individual. And so, which really, and we know this from research at this point, we know at a very young age who we are. It's just our analytical mind is not developed. So as the societal conditioning kind of kicks in, right around that time when students start school, and that's when the analytical mind starts developing, it just kind of takes over and we almost forget, right? And so to really take us back to it, it really takes connecting to our inner child, or who we were in childhood. And through that, really finding a path of actualization. So if we can structure the environment differently, then it's possible, for children to continue on the path that they know, as at that age, of who they are and what they want to do in life.
Is anyone, I know you have a lot of people that you admire in this space. Is there anyone in particular that you're really seeing that they're trying to go down the same mission that you are?
Yes, I do have a number of people that I admire. When it comes to the world of trauma healing, I think one of my biggest teachers has been Thomas Hubel. He works on the space of healing collective trauma, and I've learned so much from him. And his philosophy is the same. We are born into a traumatized world. I mean, if you really look at the history of humanity, over centuries and millennia, it's very clear. I mean, it all makes sense why there's so much trauma around the world. And the pandemic has actually added a whole layer to it. So it is part of human experience, but what we do with it, I think, is what truly matters. The space and education, or creating a new model or offering just new approach to education. I think one of my teachers and somebody who has created an entire platform, which was primarily for adults, that also tries to bring this holistic approach to education, is Vishen Lakiani, the founder of Mind Valley. And so I've learned a lot from different teachers on his platform. But speaking of education for children, there are definitely progressive schools around the world. I had the privilege of visiting the Green School in Bali a couple of years ago. And their main focus is sustainability. And so that's exactly what they're teaching. It's a school made out of bamboo, right in the middle of jungle. And so the students live and learn very, very close to nature. And so their philosophy is sustainability. The other school that I had a privilege of visiting here in California in Ojai is, I think it's called the Oak Grove. Their philosophy is exactly that is we help children develop that self-awareness, and they get to choose who they become that is authentic to them. And when I visited school, I asked them if they ever just kind of did longitudinal study on their graduates and to kind of see how their life path has shaped after graduating. And to my surprise, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that they did. And so they said, we have carpenters and we have politicians, we have people in the office, we have governors, we have teachers, we have nurses. You see there's just a broad range. It's an entire spectrum, but no matter what they chose, they are actualized in that career and they're happy as individuals. And I think that's what we're talking here, as one of the pillars of a new model of education. I've also researched a number of other schools. They're in Southern California, such as Design 39. Their main philosophy is design thinking. The High Tech High that really brings, and which is also in San Diego area, that really looks at the integration of exponential technologies and just really developing that systems thinking. So like I said, it's happening. There are pockets of it around the world. But I almost feel like all of that can be integrated because the students need that holistic intelligence development, because when that unified intelligence is well developed, in any circumstance, they can draw on the intelligence that is, the most relevant and apply to solve the problems.
I think the big buzzword now is disrupting education. And I know that I like to see it change and evolve because I feel like it's very archaic. I think a lot of people are feeling that way. The way of education doesn't fit today's model of life. And so how can we change that and be pioneers in it even more so than the ones that you just mentioned? And I'm really looking forward to having more conversations about your project, which we will discuss in another podcast / YouTube video. But is there any other parting words you want to say before we wrap up this conversation?
I just really wanted to echo what you said. The current model is truly archaic, and no matter how hard we try to bring innovation, it just becomes a layer on top of what is being done in an old-fashioned way rather than replacing it. And just to think that this education model was established almost 1.5 centuries ago, right, and on the rise of industrial revolution, and it is still the industrial model, and we're living in the information age and with exponential growth of technologies and just exponential rhythm of life. So things are definitely about to change. And a lot of thought leaders have already expressed that education is ripe for disruption. So we might see that being the next industry that is disrupted in a big way. And I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity to connect with you and exchange ideas. It's always intellectually engaging, always inspiring and exciting to just communicate with you, Amy. So thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to partnering with you on this new venture that we're starting. So, or that you
Super
started.
Excited
I'm
about
just
that.
along for the ride. I'm excited.
Super excited. And thank you. Thank you for your support.